Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today's recipe popped out of the cookbook. It was so interesting. Mutton kebabs. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So sometimes when we think about English cookery in the 18th century, we think plain cooking. We think in our terms today, meat and potatoes. But that's not necessarily always true. There were a lot of influences coming into English cookery in this 18th century, a lot of French cookery coming in, but this one popped out because it's something from, much deeper into the continent, Persian area, Turkey, that kind of a thing. So mutton kebab is just like, what is this doing in this cookbook? I have to read up on this. Did a little bit of digging. It looks like it starts to show up in these English cookbooks in the 1760s. So the first one that I've got here is Elizabeth Raffald. This one's the experienced English housekeeper, 1769. Now let me read this one. Mutton kebabed. Cut a loin of mutton in 4 pieces, take off the skin, and rub them with the yolk of an egg. Strew over them a few breadcrumbs and a little shredded parsley. Turn them round, spit them, roast them, and keep basting all the while with fresh butter. Sounds good, doesn't it? To make the froth rise. When they are enough, put a little brown gravy underneath them, serve them up, garnish with a pickle. Now this is this particular recipe is probably the plainest of them, and kebabs were supposed to be fairly spicy. So I'm going to be adjusting it and using Hannah Glass's recipe. That is a little more complex. I won't read that one to you. We won't do every single thing in that recipe, but these are so interesting for, different ones coming in and different ideas coming in, and how this influence came into Great Britain. How did these ideas, how did this particular dish, and why this particular dish, why did this come into the culture? Such really interesting questions, but let's cook the food. So to start off with, we need a breadcrumb mix. We're using the Hannah Glass recipe here. We are going to add in some breadcrumbs. She does not call for any particular amount, obviously. We've got some breadcrumbs there. Instead of putting the salt and pepper in her breadcrumb mix, we're gonna put that on the meat itself, but she calls for sweet herbs. In the earlier recipe, the Raffald recipe, she just calls for shredded parsley, but here we've got sweet herbs, we've got some mint, we've got some rosemary, and some thyme. And I also picked this recipe because Hannah Glass has nutmeg. Okay, this is our breadcrumb mix. That's done. We can set that aside. We need to have an egg wash to stick to the meat so that all this breading sticks up there. Hannah Glass calls for 3 eggs. It's kind of funny when the recipes like this actually are specific about one particular thing. She says 3 eggs, nothing else is measured. So, you could have 10 pounds of meat or 1 pound of meat. Doesn't make any sense, but that's the fun part of some of these. So our egg wash is ready. That's all that's gonna take. Now let's add some salt and pepper to the meat. It just says to lightly salt and pepper it, so we're not gonna go crazy with that. There's our salt, there's our pepper. I'm gonna set that aside, kind of make sure that gets coated. Looks good. And let's talk about the meat just for a second. The recipe calls for mutton, which shows up in these 18th century cookbooks. A lot of mutton gets eaten in the 18th century in Great Britain. Not any of that is available here to any great extent. Here in Middle America, mutton is just not on the menu. You can't find it in the grocery store. What we've got here is lamb, and that does show up sort of seasonally. So I've got some lamb. It's already chunked up for something like a lamb stew, which is exactly what they already did in the cookbook. They said, cut up these little cubes of mutton. So that's what we're using for our mutton today, some lamb. So let's coat these pieces. These smell wonderful, just getting ready to cook. The recipe calls for a small spit. We're gonna put them on these little metal skewers. I can't wait to get these on the fire. Here they are, they smell great. They've been cooking this whole time. It's been killer waiting for these to get off the fire because we wanted to eat these up. They smell great. I'm gonna try this. Now gravy was in the recipe and it's like pour gravy over it, but we're gonna try it without the gravy first because that would be totally cheating. So good. The lamb mixed with the spices, with the breadcrumbs and the butter poured over the top, right? And then the drippings that come off of it, put back onto it again. Tastes just really good and very interesting mix with the lamb. That's not typical for at least this area. Super, super good flavor. And lamb is the classic dish for these kebabs, or at least mutton, right? This is just wonderful. You could make these probably with other things very easily. It'd be great if you did it with beef or with pork or with chicken, whatever. But if you get a chance to try it with the lamb, I really, really suggest that. Now let's find out this little bit of gravy here. The gravy was drippings, mushroom ketchup is what the recipe called for. A little flour to thicken it up because they wanted a thick gravy. That's really good too. That is really good too. So good. I'm so glad we got a chance to do this one. So interesting to see these different cultures affecting English cooking in the 18th century. An important recipe to check out. If you get a chance, definitely try this one out, especially if you can do it over an open fire. You will enjoy it, I promise you. If you'd like another lamb recipe, check out this Lambs in a Blanket. That one's good too.